it's really, really hot here, so the fan is going over there. That's the whirring sound that you can probably hear. I know we're well into January, but I'm only now getting around to doing my December wrap-up. So these are the books that I read at the end of last year. First was Haruki Murakami's The Strange Library. This is a beautiful piece of design. You've got lovely, quirky illustrations inside that don't actually illustrate what's going on but relate to something in the text. I will probably talk a bit more about this in another video. Then I read Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. There's another very small volume. After my epic book challenge I was a bit over long books, so I started reading short ones, as you can probably tell. On a side note, I didn't actually finish Les Mis. It didn't arrive until about a third of the way through December, and then I was working full-time, didn't have long periods of time just to sit down and read, so I went for shorter things instead. Probably the page count is about the same as Les Mis, but you know, I'll read it sometime this year, I would think. Anyway, back to this. This is sort of advice from Rilke to, or is it Rilke? Anyway, it's advice from him to a young poet, as suggested in the title. This covers topics such as love and creativity, and I think it's one that I will want to revisit. I really enjoyed reading this, and I think it'll be a good sort of reference for life in general, so quite happy that I have my own copy of this one. Next up, I read The Library of Unrequited Love. I read this as an ebook on my phone. This one hasn't really stuck in my head that much. It's a wee while since I've read it, so I'm now sort of thinking back and trying to remember what it was about. I remember really enjoying the narrative voice and some of the themes that were touched upon, but it certainly wasn't the most memorable book of December. Then I read Haruki Murakami's latest novel, which is Colourless, to Sakura Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. Now, I'd heard quite a lot about this. A lot of Haruki Murakami fans didn't like this. One of my colleagues said she couldn't finish it. I absolutely loved this. I read it in 1 or 2 sittings, really liked the narrative voice, could really relate to the main character as well. One of my favourite things about Haruki Murakami is his use of music, and in particular of classical music. So I actually looked up Le Mal de Pas on YouTube. That translates as Years of Pilgrimage, as in the title. It was written by Franz Liszt as a piano piece. And yeah, I was listening to that as I was reading this. And it was nice to have that kind of audible connection to the narrative as well. So I definitely recommend that if you do read this, go and listen to the music as well. Haruki Murakami always makes me want to do that. I'm looking forward to reading more of his books this year. Then I read a book that I talked about briefly in my yearly wrap-up, Morris by Ian Forster. By far my favourite Forster that I've read. I've also read A Passage to India and Howard's End. I listened to this as an audiobook, but then I picked up a second-hand paperback. The title character, Morris, is struggling with his sexuality in a time when it was not acceptable to be gay. He's not a particularly likeable character, and he is quite misogynistic, but really this story is about love and overcoming boundaries and obstacles. While there were tragic elements to this, it was ultimately redemptive, and it's really nice to see that in LGBTQ fiction, because so many of the books that I've read about gay characters end in absolute tragedy. I don't want to give away the end of this, but it wasn't what I was expecting. Then I read another LGBT book, and this was a contemporary one, Alison Bechdel's Are You My Mother? Now, I saw Alison Bechdel speak at the New Zealand International Arts Festival at the beginning of last year, and I finally got around to reading one of her works. This is a graphic memoir. It's her second graphic memoir, because I couldn't get hold of her first one at the time. This is a memoir on her relationship with her mother, as the title might suggest. Her first graphic memoir focuses on her father, and this one sort of overlaps with her first one a bit, and she talks about her mother's reaction to her wanting to write a memoir about her father who committed suicide. So there are lots of conversations between her and her mother. There are also conversations between her and various therapists. There's a lot of psychoanalysis. At the beginning of each chapter she outlines a dream that she had. Overall, I found this fascinating, and it's redefined the way that I look at this medium. Next up, White Teeth by Zadie Smith. This has been on my shelf for the longest time. I've had it for years and years and haven't picked it up. The same with On Beauty. But I finally got to this and actually listened to it as an audiobook, so haven't actually read this copy. The audiobook was really fantastic. The narration was incredibly well done, and I think it really brought out the wit and humour that Zadie Smith writes with. Even though she deals with some really serious issues to do with race and belonging, there are so many funny moments, laugh out loud moments in this, and I enjoyed it so much more than I thought I was. Next we have a library book. Is Casting the Colours, The Member of the Wedding. This took me a really long time to read, even though it's very, very short, and I think that's because it demands to be read in 1 or 2 sittings. The chapters in this are really long, you don't have obvious breaks where you can stop reading. Because of that, I had to keep backtracking and rereading stuff that I'd already read. Under other circumstances, I think I would have enjoyed this a lot more if I had read it in 1 or 2 sittings, but I did really enjoy her writing style. The main character is a 12-year-old girl, and reading this as an adult, you can see that she gets into some places where she shouldn't be, and you see the threats, but she doesn't. You also see the way that she's interpreting things and how she's not quite interpreting things right, and that's the beauty of this novel. Then there's a book that is a favourite with a lot of people. It's Hark! A Vagrant by Kate Beaton. I thought that I was going to absolutely love everything in this, and there are parts of it that I didn't enjoy quite so much, partly because I don't know much about Canadian history, although she does do little bits down the bottom to sort of explain a bit, but other parts I really, really loved and thought were just hilarious. She gets the Bronte sisters just right. I think I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars because there were ones that were just sparkling and wonderful, and then there are other ones that I didn't really connect with. But overall, very funny and witty, and clearly Kate Beaton is a very clever woman. At Christmas I went all traditional and read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I'd never actually read this before, although I was pretty well familiar with the story. So many adaptations of this have been made. So I wasn't particularly surprised or overly impressed by the original, but it's a classic and this story just goes on and on. So I'm glad I've read it, but it didn't blow me away. And then there's one that I didn't enjoy quite as much as I'd hoped. It's The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, and you're all going to hate me for this. I had really high hopes for this one. I had read Neverwhere and wasn't all that impressed by it, but I had heard that this was more kind of magical realism rather than full-on fantasy. It didn't quite click as a whole for me. There were parts of this that I really appreciated and enjoyed, but then the rest of it I wasn't quite sure. Maybe it's something that will grow on me. I might hang on to it and give it a reread at some point. One thing that I thought was very well done was the bit at the beginning where he's at his birthday party and nobody turns up, and my heart just went out to him. But yeah, in general, it just wasn't quite what I was expecting. Maybe that's what it was. This next one was reviewed and recommended by Jasmine, whose channel I will link below, and I'll link her review as well. This is Sky Over the Louvre, and I'm not going to try and pronounce their names. This is a beautiful, beautiful book as an object, and the story is really interesting. It's about art, and I love it. I love it. Thank you, Jasmine, for reviewing this, because it's not the kind of thing that I probably would have stumbled across otherwise. It mostly follows the painter David, and I've studied a lot of his stuff in art history, so it was very interesting to see it put into this kind of context. You have lots of pictures of paintings. Go and look at Jasmine's review if you're interested, because she looks a bit more closely at the artwork and the story as well. And finally, I read Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. This is a very short collection of essays on feminism. A lot of stuff in here that's quite relevant to everyday life, like the title essay, Men Explain Things to Me. Sort of that assumption that as a woman you don't understand complicated things quite as much as men do. Of course, she explains it as a whole a lot better than that, and she gives examples. But the one that really struck me was one called In Praise of the Threat, What Marriage Equality Really Means. It looks at traditional marriage as being a union of unequal parts, where a woman becomes the property of a man. Of course, we don't think of marriage in this way anymore, but she talks about how there are still expectations of each party in a marriage, and how same-sex marriage subverts that. She thinks that that's one of the main reasons that people are so opposed to marriage equality. When the two parties are on equal footing because they're of the same gender, then people get uncomfortable because who will do the cleaning? Who will do all the manly things in the relationship? So that was really, really interesting and made me think in a whole different way about marriage. This is a very good little collection of essays, but like I say, that was the standout one for me. But there we are, that's what I read in December. I am still working full-time this month, so videos might be a little more sparse than I'd like, but with a bit of luck I will be back to more regular videos in February. As always, thank you very much for watching, and bye!